Hello, and welcome to our segment on the first half of teaching doctrine. This is I want to highlight and isolate that aspect of our preaching with you in this segment today. And I'm beginning with someone I actually don't know that she was amazing at teaching doctrine, particularly. I haven't read her sermons extensively because there aren't many of them actually out there. But I want to just sneak in another profile of an amazingly inspirational preacher. And so I want to introduce you to Jarena Lee in the first few minutes of our time together today. Jarena Lee, you can actually read her entire autobiography. She wrote it out at this Umilta site that you see on your screen there. And you can also read a profile of her in a chapter about her in either of the two books at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to learn more. She's just an amazing woman. And as we think about what we can learn from Jarena Lee, she was just what inspires me about her is she was so obedient to her calling and so passionate about preaching and the huge risks that she took to preach. She was born in 1773 to free but very poor parents in New Jersey, and she joined Bishop Richard Allen's African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia at the age of 21. And she narrates in her autobiography, if you read it, a dramatic calling to preach. And she just heard someone just speak to her directly, go and preach the gospel. And she said, no one will believe me. And the voice said, preach the gospel. I will put words in your mouth and will turn your enemies to become your friends. So she went and shared this with Bishop Allen, and he simply said, we have no such practice. And so she gave up. But she became depressed, and she said that a holy energy burned within me like a fire, and as that fire was smothered, she became more and more discouraged. And 8 years later, at a worship service, somebody was kind of fumbling, evidently, in their teaching, and she kind of got up and helped him out, and evidently, and was so articulate that Allen then stood next and told the congregation that he had been mistaken and that God had actually called this woman to preach. He didn't give her a church, he gave her a letter of introduction, which she carried from town to town. As an itinerant evangelist, she would go into town with his endorsement of her and then set up a revival, basically a preaching few days there. And so she simply walked regularly 20 miles a day in her ministry to accomplish her ministry and just depended on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. The reason I say she took great risks to preach, including enslavement, is that she felt called to preach in the South, to preach to her fellow African Americans, and she risked being caught and enslaved several times on her forays into the South. Everywhere she went, there was a wonderful response to her preaching, conversion, renewal, growth, and giving to missions, too. She was really eager for that. This is her simple, but to me, pretty persuasive bit of thinking about, some of her thinking about preaching and women. So simple but persuasive bit of doctrine there to begin. So we will switch gears now. I hope you're just inspired and encouraged by the ministry of Jarena Lee, one of North America's treasures in the area of preaching, I believe. So I hope you'll take the time to learn a little more about her, do a little more reading. But let's switch gears now and talk about doctrine, teaching doctrine, the theological formation of disciples. I want to give you in this next segment a call. I want to call you to embrace your calling from God to be a teacher of the church, a catechist, if you will. And in evangelical circles, we don't use that word very often, and we don't really like to talk about catechism. That sounds like a really boring thing that we made children go to in some denominations. And we don't like the word creed either. That sounds boring and dull, and even doctrine itself. And so we will get a lot of churches now that say, we just teach the Bible. Well, I want to heighten your awareness that if you are called to be a pastor, you are called to be a teacher, and a teacher of doctrine, of theology. Augustine, Chrysostom, the Reformers, the Puritans, they were passionate to equip their people with the truth. I want to share a moment in my own journey to embracing the vocation of teaching doctrine. As a young, eager InterVarsity staff worker, newly arrived at Harvard University, we had a big tool in our tool chest, and we were so confident that it would cure all the ills of the world. If you're an InterVarsity staff worker or former one, you know what I'm thinking of, and that was a Mark study. It was an intensive study of the Gospel of Mark. And a frequent outcome of that study was that people would say, I fell in love with Jesus. And that is fantastic. That is incredible and wonderful to watch happen. And not quite enough. A cult began to be very active on Harvard's campus during our years there, and a sophomore student who had been through the entire year-long study immersion in the Gospel of Mark was falling prey to their love bombing, if you will, and she was telling me about their view that everyone needed to be baptized in their church to be saved, which if you just look at the globe and the span of centuries for about 30 seconds, that's kind of patently ridiculous. But Jillian was saying, well, who are we to say that we're wrong? I don't know on what basis we can say that they're wrong and we're right. This was rather stunning to me, and it was kind of a revelation for me. In a flash, I saw that it is not enough to make Jesus really attractive. Jillian also needed to be equipped with a robust understanding of the foundations and the framework of her faith, with a theology even of baptism that was rooted in the doctrines of justification, atonement, the origins and ends of humanity, the purpose and identity of the church, and the shape and scope of the grace of God. She needed to be a practitioner of doctrine so that she could be skilled to apply it to life and to use it to defend herself against attackers. And so this is what I want for the Jillians in my congregations today, that we would be forming members who can express truth clearly and compellingly, both in evangelism outward, beyond the church, and in encouragement to each other, that they would be able to express truth well, that they would be able to defend truth by discerning close counterfeits and knowing why they matter, and maybe even knowing a little bit of the history of how our doctrines developed and how those same counterfeits are at work today that were at work in the early church. I hope for members who can apply the truth in ethics and know what this doctrine means for end of life and beginning of life issues and how we treat creation. I think back to the congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, a few years ago, where when the shooter attacked, that congregation was ready to swing into gear with forgiveness that they proclaimed to him within days. They knew their faith, and they knew what it meant for that moment. They knew the ethical dimensions of their theology. And so I pray, too, for members who can live out their faith as risk takers who are missional and joyful and walking in healing, and that the doctrines are getting steeped in the doctrines in ways that are actually healing and transforming to their souls. So as we think about why we don't do this and what some of the why we don't tend to do to teach doctrine as well as we could in our sermons and in our life as leaders of churches, and some of the practices that we need to pursue to get better at this, one of the things that I'm struck by as I listen to many sermons as a professor here at Fuller and as a member of a church and a preacher myself, is that I think we do a really good job at Fuller at teaching biblical preaching, and so we dwell within our texts and we live within them really well, and that's great. But a downside of that can be the way that William Alston puts it is that we remain inside the text. We sort of wander about the storyline, as he puts it, and we fail to reflect on the role and place of this text within a coherent theological vision of reality. And so I want to call you to look at your text and live within it deeply, of course, and to preach from within it. But there will come a moment, I hope, where you step outside it for a time to see it within the broader and deeper truths of our faith. And that's what I call finding and seizing the moment. And there will come a moment where a truth emerges from your text that wants to be highlighted, lifted up, and set apart, and lifted out of the text so that we can shine a light on it and look at it for a moment. And that may not be a lengthy moment in your sermon. It doesn't need to go on for pages and pages. It could be a very a paragraph that packs a punch. And that's great. That might be plenty. But don't be afraid, if it doesn't emerge clearly from your text, to move laterally a bit, to pivot if you need to, from the strictest exposition of this one text to get to that moment. And I have Fleming Rutledge's book, Help My Unbelief, here, because in that and several of her collected sermons, Fleming Rutledge is a wonderful preacher. And I'm forgetting, she has another book. She has several books on the specific doctrines of the atonement. And so if you just Google Fleming Rutledge in your Kindle or your source for books, you'll see several books that she's written that are collections of her sermons on various doctrines. And this is a kind of an apologetics collection of sermons. And there are many examples within those books of ways that she highlights a doctrine and articulates it well. Tim Keller, of course, is also excellent at this. So the second practice that I want to call you to is to embrace the vocation of reminding. Now, that certainly sounds really boring. Let's face it, we don't have a myriad of doctrines. We have between about 8 and 15, depending on how you break them down. And so it can feel repetitive to teach the atonement again and again. It can feel maybe unnecessary even, and haven't my people heard this already? And it can certainly feel unglamorous. Reminding your 2-year-old to pick up his toys or her toys, reminding yourself every morning to floss. These are not the glamorous parts of our day, are they? And in our society either, we don't really value people who have become highly talented at reminding. We value people who are talented at innovating, who will give us a new app and a cooler phone. And we think of people who remind others as nagging, insulting, patronizing. It's not glamorous, this ministry, but it's good. A woman was reflecting, in a magazine article I read, a woman was reflecting on her pastor's somewhat unjazzy preaching and said at his memorial service, "I realized that sitting in the pews of his church over many years, I got a deep and complete theological education. I'm betting that God said, 'Well done, good and faithful servant.'" This is a ministry that is tricky to do well, but it is needed. And I want to we will stop there, and then I will talk a little more about some of the resources we can use to do this well.